Usually, when we talk about history, it's kind of framed as this vast panoramic painting.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like a big mural or something.
Yeah, exactly. You walk into a museum and you see these giant tapestries on the walls, or, those endlessly long timelines stretching all the way down the hallway.
Oh, I love those. But yeah, they're overwhelming.
They really are. And the curator points at like a whole century and just says, there is the Industrial Revolution, or there is the fall of the Roman Empire.
Right. They just casually brush over hundreds of years.
Exactly. We look at these sprawling eras, and the sheer volume of time kind of, it protects us, right? It protects us from the immediate visceral reality of what it actually felt like to live through those specific moments.
Oh, absolutely. It creates a buffer. I mean, the broader the brushstrokes, the easier it is to maintain that, analytical distance. When you compress millions of lives and like decades of struggle into a single chapter heading in a textbook, you inherently lose the texture of the human experience. The macro narrative just totally dominates.
Yeah, totally dominates. But today, we are stripping away that buffer. For you, the listener joining us on this deep dive right now, we are going to do the exact opposite of that panoramic approach.
We are getting incredibly granular today.
So granular. We're placing a single, highly concentrated 4-line historical fragment from the year 1895 under like an electron microscope.
Right. We're zooming way, way in.
Yeah, we're looking at the precise linguistic moment a specific nation's trajectory was just, put on a ledger. Our mission today is an extreme close reading of a text that attempts to distill geopolitics, commerce, and human philosophy into just a few stark words.
And, the value of this approach is that it really forces us to interrogate the mechanics of language. Like, how does a writer or historian capture the weight of a geopolitical tectonic shift without writing a 500-page treatise?
Which nobody has time to read anyway.
Right, exactly. But the text we're analyzing today, it approaches incurialism not as this protracted geopolitical strategy, but as a sudden, catastrophic rewriting of reality.
Yeah, and just to be clear, our goal isn't to necessarily validate the text as some, objective historical doctrine.
No.
We want to dissect how the author uses grammar, vocabulary, and even pacing to construct a highly specific emotional argument about self-determination.
The pacing is so key here, too.
It really is. So let's lay the foundation. I'm going to read the source text in its entirety so you, the listener, know exactly what we are analyzing today.
And the archivist notes on this are actually really fascinating.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. What's so intriguing is that the archivist notes for this text actually include delivery instructions.
Right, like stage directions.
Exactly like stage directions. They direct that the first line should be spoken slowly, with a heavy, almost percussive emphasis on the final word. So here's the fragment. Let me just read it.
Go for it.
1895, Taiwan was sold. Not a transaction. It was destiny being rewritten.
And then there's that pause.
Right. The instructions call for a strict half-second pause right here. So let me just... And the people living here had no choice.
Wow. I mean, the brevity is just striking.
It's heavy, isn't it?
It's incredibly heavy. In merely 4 lines, the author constructs an entire framework for understanding systemic loss. I mean, the text begins with literal commodification, moves right into the philosophical implications of time and destiny, and then concludes with the absolute erasure of human agency.
It covers so much ground. So let's start dissecting that first line because the vocabulary choice immediately jumps out at me. 1895, Taiwan was sold. The text gives us the year and the location, which grounds us in, empirical historical fact. But then it hits us with that verb sold.
Ah, that's a very specific choice.
Right. I'm struggling to see this as just a stylistic flourish. Like, is sold really that uniquely brutal? Or is that just how territorial transfers were discussed at the turn of the 20th century?
Well,
like, couldn't we argue this is simply the literal functional language of the era?
That is a completely fair question, but if we look at the diplomatic conventions of the late 19th century, the language of empire was heavily, heavily dressed up in euphemism.
Oh, interesting. So they didn't talk like this.
No, not at all. Treaties from that era use phrases like, ceded in perpetuity or transfer of sovereignty or territorial concessions.
Right. Very fancy.
Exactly. The legal and diplomatic frameworks were designed to sound elevated. They were constructed to frame the exchange of land and populations as sophisticated statecraft, carried out by gentlemen operating under international law.
Gentlemen in powdered wigs or top hats, right?
Exactly. So by choosing the word sold, the author is deliberately stripping away the tuxedo, so to speak.
Oh, I like that. Stripping away the tuxedo.
Yeah. Sold drags the event out of the parlor of high diplomacy and just, well, throws it onto the dirt floor of a marketplace.
Yeah, it totally cheapens it.
Right. The author is completely rejecting the civilized veneer of cession or treaty. By framing it as a sale, the text forces the reader to view the geopolitical event through the lens of cold, unforgiving commerce.
It implies that despite all the grand rhetoric of empire, the underlying mechanism was basically no different than trading a barrel of oil or like a shipment of timber.
Precisely. It's commodification at its core.
I wonder, too, if was sold is less about objectifying Taiwan and more about inviting the empires involved for acting like petty merchants.
Ooh, that's an interesting angle.
Because it introduces this deep cynicism. Think about the mechanics of selling something. If we elevate this past the basic definition of commerce, because obviously we aren't talking about buying a wristwatch or a dining room table.
Right.
What does it mechanically mean to sell a landmass? You aren't just trading dirt.
No, you're trading everything on it.
Exactly. You are transferring a taxation base. You are transferring resource extraction rights. You're transferring a monopoly on the legitimate use of force over a specific population.
And essentially, you are commodifying an entire ecosystem of human existence.
Yes.
When a state is sold, the abstract concept of sovereignty becomes a tangible item on a ledger. I mean, the text uses the language of commerce to highlight the inherent absurdity of imperialism.
The absurdity, yeah.
Because it is absurd.
It is. The idea that the right to govern millions of lives, the mountains, the rivers, the infrastructure, that it can all be quantified, priced, and exchanged for geopolitical leverage or capital, that's absurd.
It's treating a country like a poker chip.
Exactly. And the semantic weight of the word sold is what really anchors the author's critique of that entire imperial system.
Let's push on the grammar of that line, though, because there's something else going on. Taiwan was sold.
The passive voice.
Yes, the passive voice. I understand the commercial implication now, but the use of the passive voice feels almost, I don't know, counterintuitive.
How so?
Well, doesn't standard historical framing usually center the victors? Like, we usually hear Empire X conquered this territory, or Nation Y purchased this land. Right, history is written by the winners, as they say.
Exactly. But by saying was sold, the text deliberately hides the perpetrators. I'm trying to figure out if leaving out the buyers and sellers is a rhetorical strategy to make the event feel more like a natural disaster, or if it's something else entirely.
Oh, I think that is perhaps the most sophisticated linguistic choice in the entire fragment.
Really?
Oh, yeah. By employing the passive voice, the text structurally omits the agents of the action. The historical actors, the diplomats, the monarchs, the generals, they're rendered completely invisible.
They're just gone from the sentence.
Exactly. They exist outside the boundaries of the sentence. If the author had written, say, the Qing dynasty sold Taiwan to the Empire of Japan, the sentence suddenly becomes a narrative about those two empires.
Oh, I see. Taiwan would just be the prop in their story.
Precisely. Taiwan would just be the direct object, the thing being passed between two active subjects.
Ah. So the passive voice forces the camera to stay locked on the subject being acted upon.
Yes. It traps the reader's attention on the recipient of the violence. It structurally mirrors the power dynamics of the event itself, which is brilliant.
That is brilliant.
By removing the buyer and the seller from the syntax entirely, the text isolates Taiwan as an object manipulated by unseen forces. It captures the visceral feeling of subjugation from the ground level.
Because if you're on the ground, you don't see the diplomats.
Right. For the people experiencing this historical moment, the event didn't manifest as a polite debate between two foreign capitals. It manifested as an absolute unyielding reality descending from above. Was sold becomes this immutable state of being.
That makes a lot of sense. If you are the entity being traded, you don't even get to look the buyer or the seller in the eye.
No, you're not in the room.
Right. They are operating in a stratosphere of imperial power so far removed from your daily life that their specific identities almost don't even matter to you in that moment. The only thing that matters is the crushing weight of the transaction itself.
And that actually leads directly to the author's need to immediately clarify the nature of that transaction in the very next line.
Right, because the text anticipates that the word sold implies a standard business deal.
Yeah, if something is sold, it's just economics.
But the author radically shifts the scale in line 2. Not a transaction, it was destiny being rewritten. I have to admit, I have some friction with this dichotomy.
Really? Why is that?
Well, why couldn't it be both? A transaction can be incredibly profound. The Louisiana Purchase was a transaction, right? It seems like the text is almost setting up a straw man argument by diminishing the concept of a transaction just to make destiny sound more poetic.
I can totally see why it might sound like a rhetorical flourish, but there is a rigid philosophical distinction the author is drawing here.
Okay, walk me through it.
A transaction, regardless of its scale, is inherently finite and bounded. It operates within a defined set of parameters.
Yeah.
Two parties agree on terms, value is exchanged, the ledger is balanced, and the event concludes.
Okay, so it has an endpoint.
Exactly. A transaction is locked in the past. When you buy a piece of real estate, the transaction ends at the closing table, the ink dries, and it's done.
But the effects of that transaction carry into the future. I mean, if I buy a building, I can demolish it tomorrow.
True. But the author is drawing a line between the legal mechanics of an exchange and the existential consequences of it. The text argues that framing the event in 1895 merely as a transaction, like a diplomatic transfer of sovereignty, is a dangerous minimization.
Minimization? Yeah, I guess calling it a transaction makes it sound too neat.
It fails to capture the infinite, cascading nature of the event. A transaction is changing the software on a computer. Rewriting destiny is ripping out the motherboard and replacing it entirely while the machine is still running.
Oh, wow. Ripping out the motherboard while it's running. That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it's a total system overhaul.
Okay, let's explore the mechanics of that motherboard replacement because I think that's super interesting. What does a rewritten destiny actually look like on a sociological level?
It touches everything.
Right, because destiny can sound very abstract, almost theological, you know? But if we ground it in the reality of 1895, rewriting a destiny means fundamentally altering the sociological DNA of a population.
Absolutely. It means changing the official language taught in schools.
Yes. It means replacing the currency in people's pockets. It means introducing new legal codes, new architectural standards, and new conscription laws.
And it dictates the cultural memory of the generations that follow. When the text says destiny being rewritten, it implies violence to the trajectory of time itself.
Violence to time. That's heavy.
It is. The population of Taiwan in early 1895 had a projected future. They had an organic societal evolution they were a part of. To rewrite a destiny is to abruptly and forcefully sever that timeline.
You just snip the thread.
Yeah. The original draft of their future is erased, and a completely alien narrative is superimposed over their lives.
I want to focus on the word rewritten for a moment because it necessitates the existence of an author. If a destiny is rewritten, someone is holding the pen, right? Does acknowledging an author inherently give these imperial powers too much credit? Like it almost romanticizes their power, framing them as gods of geopolitics, shaping the cosmos, rather than just, bureaucrats carving up a map for resource extraction?
The author of the text is definitely walking a fine line there. However, interpreting it through the lens of structural power, acknowledging the author, doesn't necessarily romanticize them. It actually indicts their staggering arrogance.
Indicts their arrogance. How so?
The text suggests that the empires making these decisions view themselves not just as administrators, but as the legitimate architects of human history.
Wow, the ego.
Exactly. They believe they possess the sovereign right to act as authors, to take a pen to a map and unilaterally alter the fate of millions of people they had never even met.
So it's a critique of the God complex inherent in imperialism.
Yes, precisely. The tragedy of being a character in a rewritten draft is that the character is entirely subject to the whims of an author who rarely understands the local context.
Right, they don't know the people at all.
And they almost never care about the individual character arcs. The ink dries on the treaty page in a quiet room halfway across the world, but on the ground. That ink translates into martial law, new borders, economic upheaval, and the immediate invalidation of local authority.
Think about being a passenger on a train.
Okay.
A transaction is like someone coming down the aisle and changing the price of a ticket or maybe swapping out the dining car menu.
Sure.
It's disruptive, maybe even unfair, but the train is still heading to the same destination.
Right.
Rewriting a destiny is waking up in your cabin, looking out the window, and realizing the tracks themselves have been violently rerouted during the night. You are now heading toward a completely different horizon, and the doors to the conductor's cabin are locked from the inside.
That captures the structural helplessness perfectly.
Yeah.
That is exactly what the text is getting at.
It's terrifying.
It is. And the author refuses to let the reader linger in the abstract, philosophical realm of destinies and authors. Having established the cosmological scale of the event, the text immediately snaps the focus back to the dirt, to the tangible human cost.
Which brings us to the final movement of the fragment, and I want to remind you, the listener, about those archivist instructions.
The pause.
Yes, the pause. The instructions explicitly call for a half-second pause before the final line. It's a deliberate beat of silence to let the massive concept of a rewritten destiny just hang in the air before delivering the grounding reality. And the people living here had no choice.
It's the punchline of the whole tragedy.
It really is. But I have to admit, I struggle a bit with the absolute determinism of had no choice.
In what way?
Well, it feels incredibly bleak. Historically, when macro-level forces impose their will, populations don't just become inert objects.
Of course not.
There is always resistance, adaptation, subversion. By declaring they had no choice, doesn't the text risk flattening the resilience of the people into, well, pure victimhood?
That is a crucial tension to navigate. It's a really good point. If we interpret had no choice as meaning the people became robotic slaves entirely devoid of human will, then yes, it totally flattens the history.
Right.
But I think the text is specifically referring to the macro geopolitical event. The people living there had no choice in the sale.
Ah, right, in the transaction itself.
Exactly. They were not consulted. There was no plebiscite. They did not get a seat at the negotiating table where the treaty was drafted. Their consent was entirely, completely irrelevant to the empires conducting the transaction.
So it's the erasure of macro-agency, not micro-agency.
Exactly. The text highlights the painful dichotomy between the macro-level forces acting as the invisible authors and the micro-level humans who actually inhabit the land.
The people living here.
Yes, the phrase "the people living here" is deeply grounding. It contrasts so sharply with the vast geopolitical abstraction of Taiwan was sold.
It really brings it down to eye level.
It does. The empires are trading a concept, a polygon on a map. But the text forces the reader to confront the reality that this polygon is filled with people. People walking the ground, planting crops, burying their ancestors, and possessing their own distinct, undeniable humanity.
It fundamentally questions who owns a destiny.
Right.
Does a nation's destiny belong to the sovereign power that claims the territory under international law, or does it belong to the inhabitants who generate the culture and sustain the society on a daily basis?
And the text clearly aligns with the latter.
Definitely. It points out the gross injustice of the former dictating terms to the latter.
And this is where I think the text transcends its specific 1895 context and offers a universal commentary on systemic powerlessness.
Yeah, it becomes a mirror for all of us.
It forces us to examine the illusion of control. Human beings, we build lives, we form communities, and we establish traditions under the assumption that our environment, our homeland, is a relatively stable foundation.
We take the ground beneath our feet for granted.
Completely. To realize that this foundational bedrock can be commodified, sold, and deeply altered without your consent is profoundly destabilizing.
Which makes this highly relevant for you listening to this deep dive right now. We might look at 1895 as ancient history, a time of crude imperial land grabs that we've supposedly evolved past, right?
We'd like to think so.
But the philosophical core of this text challenges how we view our own agency today. We live in an era where we are practically suffocated by micro-choices. We obsess over our personal autonomy every single day.
Oh, constantly.
What career path should I pursue? What city should I move to? What brand of coffee aligns with my political values?
Yeah, we conflate consumer choice and lifestyle curation with true systemic freedom.
We really do. We feel intensely in control of our personal destinies because we are constantly making decisions.
But this historical text strips that illusion right away. It forces us to ask, how much of our destiny is actually ours? And how much has already been written by invisible authors?
It's a scary question.
It is. Think about the overarching frameworks of our lives. The borders we are allowed to cross, the value of the currency in our bank accounts, the geopolitical alliances that dictate whether we live in peace or drafted into war.
Yeah, the macroeconomic policies that determine if we can even afford a home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These are massive macro-level destinies that are frequently imposed from the top down. The parameters of our reality are often decided in rooms we aren't allowed to enter.
Just like the people in 1895.
Just like them. When the macro destiny of a society is shifted by forces entirely outside the populace's control, whether by a treaty in 1895 or, say, a global algorithmic financial crisis today, all those fiercely guarded micro-choices suddenly seem incredibly fragile.
They really do. The text reminds us that structural power rarely asks for permission.
It just acts.
But let's return to my earlier pushback about resilience. because I don't want to leave people feeling totally hopeless.
Fair enough.
If the overarching framework is imposed, how do human beings survive the psychological weight of having no choice at the macro level? Because if the train tracks are rerouted and the doors are locked, the passengers eventually have to figure out how to live on the moving train.
They do, and they survive by weaponizing their microagency.
Weaponizing microagency, I love that.
When a population is stripped of geopolitical choice, they redirect their energy into the spaces the invisible authors cannot reach. The author might write a new script, mandating new laws and new languages, but the characters choose how they read the lines.
Meaning they adapt the forced realities into their own traditions.
Yes, they preserve their culture in domestic spaces, they create subversive art, they maintain informal economies, they survive in the margins, in the white space between the rewritten lines of their official destiny.
That's incredibly powerful.
It is. While the macro destiny is forced upon them, the micro-resistance, the daily deliberate act of continuing to exist and maintain a distinct identity, is a choice they continue to make every single day.
So the text declares they had no choice regarding the sale. But history shows us that over generations, those daily accumulations of micro-choices eventually begin to push back against the rewritten macro-destiny.
Exactly. The passive object eventually demands to become the active subject again. It's inevitable.
Wow. This has been a remarkably dense journey today, all stemming from 4 short lines of text.
It's amazing how much is packed into so few words.
It really is. We set out to extract the geopolitical and philosophical weight from a microscopic historical fragment, and I feel like it fundamentally altered how we view the mechanics of power. We started by examining the brutal linguistic choice of the word sold, dissecting how it strips away diplomatic euphemism to reveal the cold commodification of an entire landmass.
And then we explored the structural power of the passive voice, observing how it renders the perpetrators invisible while trapping the reader's focus entirely on the subjugation of the territory.
Right. And from there, we unpacked the philosophical distinction between a finite transaction and an infinite rewritten destiny, the terrifying realization that a geopolitical event can violently sever a population's organic timeline.
And we concluded by confronting the absolute erasure of macroagency, the devastating reality that the massive frameworks of human lives are so often decided without the consent of the people who actually have to live within them.
It proves that history doesn't always have to be consumed in sweeping panoramic volumes.
Not at all. Sometimes, slowing down and rigorously interrogating a single verb, a specific grammatical structure, and a half-second pause can reveal universal mechanics of systemic power that a standard textbook might completely gloss over.
I think we've thoroughly shattered the buffer that usually protects us from history today. The text gives us a definitive, tragic snapshot of 1895, a moment when a population was commodified and their trajectory rewritten by invisible hands, leaving them with no macro-level choice.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. But as we leave you today, I want to offer a final thought for you to explore on your own. The text captures the moment the pen was taken away. It tells us the destiny was rewritten. But a rewritten draft is never the final draft. It is merely the newest one.
Right. The story doesn't end there.
It never does. When an alien destiny is forced upon a group of people, how long does the semantic satiation last before the words lose their power? How many generations does it take for the descendants of the sold to pry open the doors of the conductor's cabin, grab the pen, and begin authoring the next chapter themselves?
That's the real question.
Look at the overarching destinies in your own life, the systemic, cultural, economic, or familial narratives that were locked into place by invisible authors long before you were born. You may not have had a choice in how your timeline was initially drafted, but as you navigate the rigid structures imposed upon you, consider how you are currently operating in the margins. How are you weaponizing your microagency within those unchosen frameworks to ultimately write your own next lines?